Okay, great. So the individuals who study specifically sensation are what's called psychophysics. Okay, because what they want to know is what one is how do we sense, how do we see, how do we smell, touch, all of those things, and taste. And at what levels, how much intensity of a stimuli is necessary for us to actually sense it, okay? Because there's limitations in every type of species of what we can see. We can't see, for example, ultraviolet, but a bee can, is an example of what they want to know based on our sensation system, okay? And there's things that humans are good at, and there's some things that we don't have as much acuity as other animals. So basically, the big questions that they want to know is, how do we sense and perceive our world? And we'll talk about why we have to talk about those two things as two separate processes, okay? So how do we see, how do we hear, how do we taste and smell? And then we need to look at touch and pain. At what point is too much touch that then turns into a pain signal, okay? So let's real quickly just talk about the two definitions of sensation and perception, okay? So sensation is the sense organ's detection of external physical stimuli, okay? And the transmission of that information from about the stimulus to the brain, all right? Perception, however, is the processing, organization, and interpretation of that sensory information in the brain. These processes result in internal neural representations, all right? And again, the reason why we have to look at these separate is because what we sense isn't necessarily what we perceive, as we will see as we go along, okay? So, for example, light stimuli that actually hits the back of the eye and starts the process of sensation or detection of sensations. If we were to just see that image, what's being stimulated at the back of the eye, our eye acuity would be about the same as looking out a window when it's raining really hard and we don't have windshield wipers, okay? That's the actual, what the picture in the back of our eye actually looks like. But then that information is sent to the occipital lobe, and then based on our past and what we should be seeing, it creates the sharper images that we see visually, okay? And then also we have to talk about it separately, you know, if we were all in this room, the people on Zoom, okay, the temperature is set at a specific temperature, okay? But if I were to go around the room and ask, do you feel warm, cold, or neutral? Probably everyone in the room would give a slightly different answer. Or if I put it on a scale of 1 to 10 from cold to warm, okay? Because our bodies are both biologically and psychologically tuned to try and make sense of the temperature in the room. So should it be hot or should it be cold? Those types of things. If you ever, even if you're in a warm room, for example, you're watching a movie where there's snow and cold, even though you're in a room warm, in a room where it's warm, you're more likely to perceive it as cold because of the movie you're watching, okay? And so that's why these two things have to be kind of looked at differently, okay? All right. And then we have to understand the way physical stimuli then get into a neural basis, okay? So we have our sensory receptors, and dependent upon what it is that we're sensing determines what type of sensory receptor we use. So for example, smell and taste, we have chemical receptors. Okay? When it comes to hearing, it's based on hairs, and the hairs vibrating inside the auditory canal that creates sound for us. When we look at vision, we're looking at wavelengths, okay? And so those stimuli then need to get changed into a neurochemical reaction to go into the brain. And that's the process of transduction. Transduction is a process of sensory receptors change physical stimuli into signals that are eventually sent to the brain. Okay, and this is the process of transduction. So as this figure kind of indicates, you know, physical stimuli, the traffic light turns green, the sensation light is then detected, and then through this process of transduction, that visual information is then turned into neural signals, which then go back to the cortical occipital lobe back here after it goes through the thalamus. And then that tells us what to do based on that stimuli, which in this example is then to go. So this is kind of just a quick example of transduction. Okay. And different areas of the brain process different types of stimuli. So as we've mentioned before, the primary visual cortex does visual information. The parietal lobe does information based upon space and time. When we look at the primary sensory cortex, it's detecting sensations within the body. So, you know, the pressure on the bottom of your feet when you walk, those types of things. The primary gustorial cortex measures taste. Temporal lobe and primary auditory cortex processes auditory information. And then smell is measured right here or detected in this area, okay? And then the frontal cortex, its job is to take in all of that information, both sight, auditory, smell, and make sense of it and interpret it, okay? So, as I said, one of the things that psychophysics tries to do is determine at what amount of stimuli do we detect information, and they do it in two different ways. One is absolute threshold, and this is the smallest amount of physical stimuli required to detect it. Okay, so what size or how much is necessary for us to detect different stimuli, such as taste and something, such as how far our visual system can go. Difference thresholds is the minimum difference between physical stimuli required to detect the difference between sensory input. So, for example, if I put my phone on here, okay, how much more weight does it take for me then to detect a notice in the weight? Okay, so how much more do I have to add in for me to detect the difference in the weight of the phone? Okay. And there's two laws that are based on this. One is Weber's law, and it measures the amount of change, what percentage of change needs to occur for us to detect it. And then the just noticeable difference kind of plays off of Weber's laws. It's just how much stimuli do we need to know to detect a difference, okay? So this is an example of absolute threshold, okay? Absolute threshold is a level of stimuli intensity at which a person can detect at least 50% of the time. So as this is showing about right here, the intensity is this bottom line, correct detection. What we want to know is what is the 50% mark to hear that certain tone, okay? So here are some examples of absolute threshold. So this is where, again, 50% of people can either sense this or they can't, but it's about the average if you want to think about it. So for taste, we can taste 1 teaspoon of sugar and 2 gallons of water. Smell, 1 drop of perfume diffused in the entire volume of 6 rooms. So if you take 6 rooms and someone puts just a little piece of perfume, we can detect it about 50% of the time. Smell, touch. We can fly's wing falling on our cheek at a distance of about 0.04 inches. So just that little sensation. Hearing, the tick of a clock at about 20 feet under quiet conditions. And then our visual acuity is we can see a candle flame up to 30 miles away in the dark and clear night. Now, this is the way you need to think about this 30-mile thing is you got to imagine it's in a vacuum. Okay, and you can't, and there's no interference such as pollution or other lights coming in and messing it up. So yes, we can see at 30 miles. The reason why most of us don't see it is because of the pollution or the interference of other lights. So, but if it was a perfect vacuum, our visual system is about 30 miles, give or take a few. So. And then we also have something called sensory adaptation, and this is decreased sensitivity to a constant level of stimulus, okay? The best example of sensory adaptation, I think, is when we're driving in a vehicle, okay? A lot of, especially long-haul truck drivers tend to develop hearing problems. And it's because when we're actually driving down the road noise and all the cars around us are actually very intense to our hearing system. But because we're paying so much attention to, for example, driving, the radio, the sensations around us, we adapt to that noise so we don't necessarily hear it. But it is there, and it is actually damaging the ear for a lot of long-term, long-haul drivers. So, the other issue that when we get into sensory information and perception is we have to remember that when we're sensing information, so we get this sensory information from here, the left side of our visual field is going to be processed by the right hemisphere of the brain, okay? Whereas the left area of our visual field is processed by the right visual field is processed by the right lobe. And this is the reason why, that we think is the reason why, is when we sense something in our eyes, okay, we're actually seeing it upside down. So if we were to look inside your eye and put a picture on the back of your eye, it would be inverted, okay? By processing it like that, it kind of takes the image and it flips it back around so that we're actually seeing it from bottom to top, okay? And that's kind of the reason why sense information is processed by the opposite side of the occipital lobe, okay? Now, again, and when we look at this, when we get damage to, let's say, this left hemisphere of the brain, we're actually unable to sense the right part of our visual field. Basically, it feels like we're blind in one eye because it's no longer processing that information. Okay. And this is something that is really interesting, especially about vision, is that every time we open our eyes, nearly half of your brain springs into action, okay? Because not only does it have to be processed in the visual field, but it has to be processed in the peripheral lobe, because that gives us the sense of depth, okay? The peripheral lobe didn't fire, it would seem like you guys in this room would be right here, okay? Because it's the peripheral lobe that allows us to see depth, okay? And then we also have the area of the corticals, the semantic area saying, all right, here's the visual sensation. So you have an area of the eye, and then it's telling the motor area of the motor to say, you need to focus the eye or you need to unfocus the eye a little bit and adjust the visual field so you can see clearer. Okay. When we look at the eye again, the light waves pass through the cornea, then passes through the pupil area of the eye. In the iris, the circular muscle gives eyes their color and controls the pupil size of the eye. Okay. And so this is a kind of a regulatory system that, if we get too much light in our eyes, it will overwhelm the sensory system. If we get too little, then we can't really see at all. So the darker it is, the bigger the pupil. The lighter it is, the smaller the pupil. Okay. Now there are some exceptions to this. Okay. For example, when you're on a date and if you really like the person, your pupils will not contract. Okay. So if you think someone really likes you, and let's say you're in a darker room, flash a light in their eyes. If their eyes don't dilate, they might be into you. Okay. Another area is, and it's not used very often, the CIA uses it a little bit when they're interrogating people, but when a person is stressed, meaning that they're about to lie, regardless of the amount of lights in the room, there's what's called a micro burst in the pupil of the eye, where just within a few seconds it will shrink and then it will dilate again. Okay. And so a lot of individuals use this for an interrogation to see what they're, whoever they're interrogating, are they being stressed enough in order for them to answer correctly? Okay, so there's some exceptions to the rule of the pupil being regulated just by light and how much light. There are certain situations where the pupil will react given the stimuli. We think in the dating example, for example, where the pupil is holding consistently, it's because at that point, the person who is in focus and that likes you is into you. So it doesn't matter how much light, they're just focusing on that individual. And that's why we think that occurs. The stress reaction with the pupil of the eye, we think just has to do with you're about to tell a lie or you're about to deceive someone. And so the pupil, there's a missed connection in the pupil. The eye is basically saying, hey, buddy, what are we trying to do here? Okay. And so it's kind of almost a stress reaction on the eye's part, saying because you're about to do something very inconsistent. Okay. And then in the retina, the thin inner surface in the back of the eye is where all of our sensory receptors are. And we have both rods and we have cones, okay? The rods in the eye really sense black and white, or you can say the shades also in black and white. So what the rods do is they kind of help us see the outline of things, and they're very sensitive to light. In fact, I would challenge you to do this. rods sit near the exterior of the retina, okay? And if you're in a dark room, like maybe you have to get up at night and use the restroom, what I would ask, what I would challenge you to do is most people, when it's dark, they kind of squint and try to look forward to try and see where they're going. But what I would challenge you to do is look at the outside, okay? Instead of trying to focus forward, kind of look to your periphery, and you'll notice that the room will light up. Because the area of the eye that you're utilizing to look at your periphery is the rods. And because they're more sensitive to light, they'll actually lighten up the room for you, okay? The cones, on the other hand, are sensitive to color, okay? So these are what gives us our visual color. And again, when you look into your periphery, everything becomes more shades of black and white. When you focus in the middle of your eye, you can see colors a little bit more vividly. Okay, so when you're trying to admire a piece of artwork, instead of trying to look intently with the middle areas of your eyes, and it will actually pop up a little bit better. Okay. In comparison, each retina holds about 120 million rods, 6 million cones. Near the center of the retina, a small region called the fovea, where cones are densely packed. So near where the sensory neurons exit the eye, just right around there is the most intense number of cones where you see color at a much more dense perception. Okay, so from that point, we're sensing the information, and it's going to then, it kind of, how do I explain this? Information from the eyes, it's just not the sensory cones and rods that matter, because that information is then sent to a ganglion cell that just sit right behind those visual cells, okay? And those ganglion cells gather the bundle, it kind of puts the information together, okay? And then they exit in the optic nerve, okay? Now, this is another example of the difference between sensations and perceptions, okay? Is on Wednesday, I'll actually show you how you can see your blind spot. Because where those nerves exit, there is no sensory cells there. And so technically, we all have blind spots about the middle of our visual field, but we don't sense it because when it goes back to the occipital lobe, it interprets what we should be seeing. Not necessarily what we are seeing, but what we should be seeing, okay? So when we talk about the electromagnetic waves, we're talking about the waves that we can see, and we can see lengths from about 400 to 700 nanometers, okay? And this is based, in the color we see is based on both the amplitude and the wavelength. So the amplitude is the height, the wavelength is a width of the wave, okay? So amplitude gives a quality of brightness, okay? So the higher the wave, the more bright it is. And the wavelength gives us determines the perception of hue, which is the color, or the difference between black and white, that area in between. So this is an example of the 400 to 700, and then the areas that humans can't see, for example, are UV light, X-rays, infrared, microwaves, and then radio waves. We can't see those, even though, as we know, those are converted into sound waves, okay? So as this diagram, this expresses hue, right? And so the wavelength determines the hue. So these two colors, blue versus red, the blue is a shorter wavelength than say a red color, which becomes longer and longer. Okay. And just as this shows, the lower the amplitude, the darker it appears. Whereas the higher the amplitude, the more light it attracts. So there's a lot of theories about how we see colors. Probably the most famous is a trichromatic theory. And what it suggests is that we have basically three types of cones that see the three primary colors. And I think there's a graph right here. So we have cones that have blue, green, and red. Okay. And the reasons why we can see other colors just besides blue, green, and red is you'll notice that these waves all overlap with each other. So we see a blue wave, but if we're also detecting a red wave and a green wave, we see this lighter blue color going into green, okay? And same here, red and green produce the yellow colors where they intersect. So based just on these three types of cones is how we can see all of the colors of the color spectrum that we are able to, from 400 to 700. Okay. And we also, that partly explains the way we see things, but there is also something called the opponent processing theory. And what the opponent processing theory suggests is how we can see differences in stimuli. So I'm hoping everybody is looking at this A, and you're seeing this 45 right here, and this is the one I want you to pay attention to, because if you don't see the 45, you're what's called colorblind. Okay, and so there's a couple types of color blindness. Either you will see the 45 and you won't see the green and yellow, or all you'll see is the green and yellow stimuli. Okay, and what this means is that, again, the brain and the eye have to make sense of this difference in stimuli, okay? But if you're unable to see red colors, the brain and the eyes are going to fill in all of these little circles with that green and yellow that you see, okay? So it's not necessarily that it would just be a white area. The brain and the eyes fill it in to make sense of the stimuli that you're trying to perceive. Okay. All right, this may be difficult to do. Okay, let's give this a try. If it doesn't work, I'll bring a different example next week. What I want everyone to do is focus on this little dot. And all I want you to do is focus on this little dot, okay? And then when I tell you to change, I want you to look over at this dot on the white area, okay? So don't change until I tell you to. So let me put my stopwatch up. Hold on just a second. Okay, so again, when I tell you to just look at this dot, and then when I say change, look over and look at this one. So are we ready? Mm-hmm. Start. page. Anyone see the image? Yeah, okay. So if we did it right, this green should have been red, right? And what color did this one turn? Yeah, remember. And then the yellow looked different too. It looked like the American flag. It should have.
I just saw the outline.
Yeah.
I just know the lights on the outline.
Okay, you just saw the outline.
Yeah.
What I would challenge you to do is this PowerPoint is on the Canvas page, and bring it up one time when you're in a dark room, but there's still light on this. Okay, this will glow for you, and then change. Again, look at that for about 25 seconds, and then look at the next image. And what you should see is an American flag in the correct colors, red, blue, and white, right? Yeah, white, okay. Because what is happening when this works is that wearing out the sensory cells for green, this yellow color, and black, okay? And those are worn out. But then when you change to this side, your brain is still thinking that you should be sensing something, okay? Because that was the expectation, right? Because you were focusing on that dot, now you're focusing on that dot. But because you wore out, for example, the green cells in the back of your eye, you're supposed to be seeing something, so it will start lighting up the red cells or the red retinas, so that you, again, are making sense of what you are expected to be seeing. But because you wore out those cells, they have to ignite another one. Okay, so that's kind of what this activity does. I would encourage you to kind of do it when you're in a darker room and report back and let me know what you see. And that's an example of opponent processing theory, and that's the idea behind this kind of activity. All right, without reading this, what do you see? Do you see a young woman or an old woman?
Both.
All right. What are you seeing?
Okay, young lady.
A young lady.
Young lady. All right. How about online? I heard a few people say something.
Young lady.
Young lady.
Okay. All right. Most are seeing the young ladies. Who said that they can see both?
I
Right.
can see both.
Okay.
I
So
can see both.
let's see. Where is the old lady? Can someone explain?
She's looking down.
All right. So where's her? So this would be her nose, right?
Mhm.
And this is her mouth right here. And then the old lady's eyes are right here. Does everyone see that?
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes.
And then the young lady is then looking away, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So this comes from what's called Gestalt theory or Gestalt psychology, which suggests that we don't see things in pieces, we can see things in wholes. Okay, so we put this stimuli together, and then based upon what we want to be experiencing, determines what we see as a whole instead of taking apart by piece. Okay, and so again, this is the difference between sensations and perceptions. If we were to have recorded the last 2 weeks of your experience, whether you were with older people or younger people, if you were with younger people, you're more likely just to see the young girl. If you've been with older people, you're more likely just to see the older person. And then a few of you could see both because you've been with probably both young and older people over the last couple of weeks, okay? And so that's the idea behind Gestalt theory, is that we see things as whole and what we expect to see, okay? Based upon our previous experiences, all right? And so some of the ideas behind Gestalt theory is a term, we determine things, and this is largely in the peripheral lobe, is figure and ground. An object is a figure that is distinct to the background. The background is referred to as the ground, okay? And this allows us to, again, process depth, all right? Because we can see each other, you become the figure, and then everything else is in the background, okay? Grouping is when we organize information based on wanting to have a unified object or a unified information, okay? And so these are some examples of how we group, okay? If you notice these random dots, these dots are actually the same distance from each other. If we were to measure the distance from here to here and from here to here, it's actually the same. But because of the way these dots are arranged, we've grouped them. If you notice, we kind of group them into 3 groupings. This group here, this group here. Now these are further apart, and this group here. Okay. Yeah, these are further apart, but when we look at these individual ones, there should be a connection between all of them, okay? Law of similarity, when we see things change, we see that there's a change based on how similar those objects are, okay? Continuity is intersections are interpreted so they are continuous. So we see a green bar as one piece, even though it's being blocked by this cylinder. So we assume that green piece is one big rectangle, but for all we know, it could be 2. But because of the way we perceive it, and we want things to be continuous, we tend to make this assumption. This is the law of closure. So if you notice, we had all probably identified this as triangle, right? Because in our mind, we put these imaginary lines right here. And if we had a piece of paper, you'd probably even actually perceive those lines, okay? It's harder to do on a PowerPoint. But in reality, these are just 3 different angle pieces. They're not necessarily a triangle. They're just 3 angles. Okay. And then illusory contours are perceived even when they do not exist. So we see the contour lines in this box. So if you notice in this one, you kind of see, or this line right here, right? This line right here, this line right here, to make this make sense. It's not actually there. We see this inner box as lighter than the background. It's actually the same color, okay? There is no difference, but we perceive that difference because that's what our brain is expecting. So we also have to understand that we have bottom-up processing versus top-down processing, okay? Bottom-up processing is when environmental stimuli is having more of a role into how we're perceiving things, okay? Top-down processing is when our expectations we have dictate our experience, okay? And probably the best example of this, even though it's of top-down processing, not necessarily from a sensory perspective, but some experiments done in social psychology, and I'll give 2. One, if we set up a participant's day where they'll hear equal amounts of positive things with equal amounts of negative things, okay? But at the start of the experiment, we have them come in and we give some bogus thing like a bogus personality test or something like that, or we might just measure some nonsense thing like blood pressure, okay? And we'll say, based on the results that we have, you're going to have a horrible day. Or based on our results, you're going to have a really good day, okay? And then we go, at the end of the day, we bring the participants back and we say, how many good things can you recall? How many bad things you can recall? Okay. Now, the people who were told they were going to have a bad day remembered pretty much all the bad things that happened to them that day and don't remember any of the good things. Okay. And this is an example of top-down processing, that your brain is saying, this is what we should be experiencing today. So it completely ignores any of the other sensory information, such as compliments, in order to make sense of what they were told earlier that morning. Another example is from one of my areas of study is dealing with loneliness. Okay, so again, we bring participants in, we give them some bogus personality tests. Okay, but then we randomly tell the participants, you know what, based on your personality test, I hate to tell you this, but you're going to have a very lonely experience in life. You're not going to be well liked. Not a lot of people are going to want to interact with you. You'll probably end up in a lot of divorces if you try to get in relationships. Okay. And we tell other participants that they're very social, that you're going to be a very social person. You attract people to you. You're going to have some really healthy relationships in your life, those kinds of things. And then again, we go and measure what's the difference, right? And we find that the people who were told they were alone and everything, some of the things that deal with loneliness is that you become hypervigilant, you start having blood pressure issues, and all of those things. So we measure all of those things. And once again, the brain starts to make it so that the person that was told they were going to be lonely, they seek out opportunities to be rejected by people. Because that's loneliness, right? Is rejection. The people who were told were going to be social, one, their physiological readings were good, but they also then sought out more social opportunities than did the lonely group. Okay. And again, this is at the end, we brought them in and said, well, this was bogus. So we didn't let them live their life thinking they were going to be lonely or healthy. So just an ending to that research. But again, this is an example of top-down processing, where you're using what you're expected to have, and that's your experiences. And we probably do this, if in the real world, you think about, well, let's say you have to drive to school this morning and whatnot, or drive to a job and, you're running late, you get cut off in traffic. You spill coffee all over you and everything, so your morning starts out really shitty. Well, I want you to think about those mornings. How did the rest of your day go? You probably perceived it as a shitty day. Okay? Everything was a mess. But then when you have one of those mornings where you get to work on time, traffic was fine, your coffee didn't spill all over. At the end of the day, if we had you journaling, more than likely you would have had a pretty good day that day. Okay. And again, this is expectations. This is how expectations work, is they actually interrupt sensation and perception systems to make it so that you perceive what you're expected to perceive. Okay. And then examples of bottom-up processing is for example, when you put your hand on a burner. Okay. Now, if you're doing top-down processing all the time, you wouldn't notice that that's an emergency and you should instantly let go. Okay. Bottom-up processing is when the sensations become intense enough that they take over, and top-down processing and saying, I know you're supposed to have a good day, but your hand's burning. Okay, and then you have to withdraw or instantly. So top-down processing usually happens, bottom-up processing usually happens more when it's an emergency type of stimuli. Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah.
So this is another example of what I'm trying to say again, bottom up, top down processing. So the intent, if you look at the tendencies to perceive stimuli in specific ways that make sense given the prior experience. So this figure 514.14, if you notice these aren't really an A, they could be an H or they could be an A, but we use the information around us. So you'll notice we read this as the and this as cat, even though these two shapes are exactly the same. Okay, so we use contextual information to determine what a word is or something, even if it's not said right. So that's an example of top-down processing. Okay, and this is just another example, but I think we have that. The other thing about human beings is we have binocular vision, okay, and monocular vision. Binocular, the way that things transition, so we kind of see cross-eyed in a lot of ways, and that cross gives us the sensation of depth, okay? And monocular depth cues are cues of depths that are available in each eye alone. So binocular vision uses both eyes to determine a sensation, and monocular only uses one eye. So for example, if you ever kind of look at something directly with both eyes, you close one eye and you'll see it's something different. And then you open that eye and close the other one, you'll see something even different. Sometimes it will come closer, sometimes it'll get more distant, but and that's an example of monocular vision. Okay. The issue with monocular vision is if you'll notice, if you close one eye, part of your visual field disappears. Okay, because we rely on binocular vision in order to see the full visual field. Okay. Get through this. Like 76 slides in this presentation, so I'm trying to get to the important stuff. All right, this is another good example of, let's start talking about illusions in our system, okay? So these two tables, are they the same or are they different?
Probably the same, but the perspective is just different, so it looks different.
Exactly, yes. So if we went up and we measured this distance from here to here is the exact same distance as here to here, and same with here to here and here to here. But again, as mentioned, the reasons we perceive these as different is because of the direction of the lines. Okay, so this is an example of illusions, right? Let's take a look at another. I actually want to stop sharing for just a minute.